Every single screen in America's busiest airport suddenly goes black. Security gates lock. Departure boards flicker and die. Thousands of travelers stranded as one man's finger hovers over a smartphone app that could shut down the entire aviation system. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe now to support more stories about standing up against injustice. You won't believe what happened when a racist flight attendant pushed the wrong elderly black man too far. This decorated war veteran and technology genius had spent 30 years protecting every airport in America. But when systematic discrimination threatened to destroy his dignity on his wedding anniversary, he had one final card to play. Sound of systems shutting down intensifies. What you're about to witness will change how you think about prejudice, power, and the price of underestimating people based on the color of their skin. This is the story of Dr. Edward Morrill, and the day he literally shut down the world to wake it up. Our story begins in 1962, in the segregated neighborhoods of Dayton, Ohio, where 8-year-old Edward Morrill was already displaying the brilliance that would one day revolutionize airport security across America. While racial tensions gripped the nation during the height of the civil rights movement, young Edward found refuge in the basement of his family's modest home on the west side of town. His father, James Morrill, worked the night shift as a janitor at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, one of the few jobs available to black men with military experience. His mother, Dorothy, spent her days hunched over a sewing machine in their converted basement, taking in alterations to make ends meet. But Edward was different. While neighborhood children played baseball in vacant lots, he could be found dismantling every electronic device he could get his hands on. Radio circuits fascinated him. Television components mesmerized him. By age 10, he was rebuilding radios from scratch and selling them to neighbors for pocket change. Edward's internal voice: while other kids played outside, I was taking apart every electronic device I could find. Each circuit told a story. Each wire held a secret. I knew that understanding these machines would somehow be my ticket to a different kind of life. The Morrill household operated under strict rules. Education wasn't optional. It was salvation. Dorothy worked 16-hour days to pay for Edward's science fair materials. James brought home discarded electronic equipment from the air base, knowing his son could transform technological trash into treasure. Despite attending an underfunded school where textbooks were outdated and laboratory equipment barely functional, Edward's mind absorbed complex mathematical concepts like a sponge. Teachers noticed his exceptional abilities, but often questioned whether such advanced thinking could truly originate from a black student in their district. High school brought new challenges and greater triumphs. Edward entered Fairmont High School in 1976 as the only African-American student enrolled in advanced mathematics and science courses. While his white classmates arrived with private tutoring and expensive calculators, Edward carried a notebook filled with hand-drawn circuit diagrams and equations he'd taught himself. The isolation was crushing. Lunch periods spent alone. Study groups that mysteriously formed without including him. But Edward channeled every slight, every whispered doubt, into academic excellence that couldn't be ignored or diminished. His breakthrough came during the 1978 State Science Fair. While other students presented volcano models and plant growth experiments, 17-year-old Edward unveiled something revolutionary: a computerized security system that could identify individuals through facial recognition technology, an innovation decades ahead of its time. The judges were skeptical. His own teacher, Mrs. Henderson, pulled him aside with barely concealed suspicion. Flashback dialogue: Edward, this is incredibly sophisticated work. Are you absolutely certain you didn't receive assistance with this project? Perhaps from someone at your father's workplace. The accusation stung because it was so familiar. How many times had his intelligence been questioned? How often had his achievements been attributed to luck, outside help, or administrative error? But Edward's presentation spoke for itself. He demonstrated how his system could theoretically track movement through secure facilities, identify unauthorized personnel, and alert security to potential threats. The technology was crude by today's standards, but visionary for 1978. He won first place at the state level, earning a full scholarship to Ohio State University. More importantly, he'd proven to himself that his mind could overcome any barrier that society placed in front of him. College offered new freedoms but familiar challenges. Edward majored in electrical engineering while working part-time jobs to support himself. His parents had sacrificed everything to get him this far, but they couldn't afford dormitory fees or meal plans. The Gulf War changed everything. Watching news coverage of precision-guided weapons and electronic warfare systems, Edward realized that military service could provide both patriotic purpose and advanced technical training. Against his parents' wishes, they'd lived through too much history to trust government promises. Edward enlisted in the Air Force immediately after graduation. 300 miles northeast, in Boston's Roxbury neighborhood, another exceptional mind was overcoming similar obstacles. Diane Williams was the daughter of Jamaican immigrants who'd arrived in America with advanced degrees that meant nothing to employers who saw only accent and skin color. Her father, Dr. Marcus Williams, had been a respected physician in Kingston, but found himself mopping hospital floors in Boston because his medical credentials weren't recognized by Massachusetts licensing boards. Her mother, Grace, had taught secondary school mathematics in Jamaica, but cleaned office buildings at night to supplement the family's meager income. The Williams family lived in a cramped 3-bedroom apartment that housed 7 people, parents for children, and Grace's elderly mother who'd followed them to America. Money was scarce, but education remained sacred. Every paycheck was stretched to cover textbooks, school supplies, and the small luxuries that helped their children compete academically with more privileged classmates. Diane witnessed healthcare inequality firsthand when her father suffered a massive heart attack during her sophomore year of high school. She watched emergency room staff treat him differently once they realized he was just a hospital janitor, not the physician he'd once been. She observed how quickly medical attention improved when her mother mentioned that Dr. Williams spoke 5 languages and held advanced degrees. Diane's internal voice, "I watched how they treated my father differently because of our skin color and assumed economic status." Medical professionals who should have seen only a human being in distress instead saw stereotypes and made assumptions. That's when I knew I had to become the person making healthcare decisions, not the family member begging for them. Disadvantaged patients who often receive substandard care because they lack social connections or couldn't navigate complex medical systems. Diane graduated as valedictorian from Boston Latin School, earning admission to Harvard University's prestigious nursing program. The scholarship covered tuition but not living expenses, so she worked multiple jobs: weekend childcare for wealthy families in Beacon Hill, evening tutoring for struggling pre-med students, and overnight shifts at a psychiatric facility. Harvard's nursing program was rigorous and competitive. Diane found herself one of only 3 black students in her cohort, facing subtle discrimination from classmates who questioned whether affirmative action had helped her gain admission. She responded by studying harder, performing better on clinical rotations, and graduating summa cum laude with honors that couldn't be questioned or diminished. Her specialty became pediatric nursing, drawn to children's honesty and resilience. She started as a staff nurse at Boston Children's Hospital, working double shifts to gain experience in multiple departments. Her superiors quickly recognized her clinical excellence and natural leadership abilities. But Diane wanted more than bedside nursing. She enrolled in evening classes to earn her master's degree in healthcare administration, studying hospital management while working full-time. Her goal was ambitious: become the first African-American woman to lead a major pediatric hospital in Ohio, where she'd eventually relocate to be closer to her extended family. Fate intervened during the summer of 1991. Technical Sergeant Edward Morrill was on leave in Boston, visiting MIT to discuss graduate school opportunities under the GI Bill. Diane was completing her master's thesis research at Harvard Medical Library when their paths crossed at a coffee shop near Harvard Square. Edward noticed her first, a strikingly beautiful woman surrounded by medical textbooks and administrative policy manuals, taking notes with the focus of someone who understood that education was precious and not to be wasted. Diane noticed him second, a handsome serviceman in dress uniform who seemed genuinely interested in her research rather than try to impress her with military stories. Their first conversation lasted 4 hours. Edward described his electronic warfare specialization and dreams of revolutionizing security technology. Diane shared her vision of transforming healthcare delivery for underserved communities. Both had experienced the unique pressure of being the first in their families to attend prestigious universities, the first to pursue professional careers, the first to navigate predominantly white institutions while maintaining their cultural identity. Their courtship unfolded through letters, phone calls, and precious leave periods when Edward could visit Boston. Diane supported his decision to pursue electrical engineering at MIT while continuing his military service. Edward encouraged her hospital administration career and her goal of eventually leading a major medical facility. They married in 1993 in a small ceremony that reflected both their humble backgrounds and their soaring ambitions. Edward's Air Force colleagues attended alongside Diane's nursing school friends, creating an unusual wedding party that bridged military and medical worlds. Edward's post-military career began modestly. Using his GI Bill benefits and MIT connections, he founded Morrill Security Systems in 1995, operating from their Boston apartment's spare bedroom. His first contracts were small, alarm systems for local businesses, security consultations for community organizations. But Edward's vision was larger. He understood that electronic security would become increasingly important as America entered the digital age. His military experience with classified systems gave him insights that civilian competitors lacked. His engineering training provided technical skills that security industry veterans couldn't match. The breakthrough came in 1998 when the Transportation Security Administration was formed following growing concerns about aviation security. Edwards' company bid on early TSA contracts, proposing integrated systems that combine facial recognition, behavioral analysis, and threat detection in ways that hadn't been attempted previously. His first major contract was Logan International Airport, a pilot program testing advanced security technologies. The system Edward designed exceeded every performance metric, detecting threats that traditional security missed while reducing false alarms that disrupted passenger flow. Success bred success. Morrill Security Systems expanded rapidly, winning contracts at airports across the Northeast, then the Midwest, eventually nationwide. Edwards' innovations became industry standards: multi-layered threat detection, predictive behavioral analysis, and seamless integration between various security technologies. By 2010, Edward had become one of America's most influential but least known technology entrepreneurs. His security systems protected over 450 airports, countless government facilities, and major corporate headquarters. The irony wasn't lost on him. A black man from Dayton, Ohio, had become responsible for protecting the very institutions that had once excluded people who looked like him. Diane's career flourished parallel to Edward's success. She left Boston in 2000 to become assistant administrator at Cincinnati Children's Hospital, then chief nursing officer in 2005, finally hospital president in 2012. Her appointment made national news, the first African-American woman to lead a major pediatric hospital in the Midwest. Together, they'd built a life that exceeded their childhood dreams. Their Columbus penthouse overlooked the city where they'd chosen to make their home. Their combined success had created financial security that their parents' generation couldn't have imagined. But they'd made one crucial decision early in their marriage: no children. Both had devoted themselves so completely to breaking barriers in their respective fields that parenting would have required compromises they weren't prepared to make. Edward's voice: "We decided early on we'd be each other's family." Diane had her hospital patients. I had my security systems protecting millions of travelers. We figured that was enough purpose for one lifetime. Turns out that was exactly what we both needed. Their love story was built on mutual respect, shared ambition, and the understanding that comes from walking similar paths. They'd both overcome systematic discrimination through excellence that couldn't be ignored. Diane's brutal hours during medical school and residency, the pressure of being visible minorities in leadership positions, the subtle racism that neither could completely escape despite their success. But nothing had prepared them for what awaited at Gate B, 12 on their 30th wedding anniversary trip to Louisville, Kentucky, where Edward would receive the National Medal of Technology and Innovation, the highest honor America bestows on its most innovative engineers. Little did they know that their biggest challenge wasn't behind them. It was waiting in the first-class cabin of Flight 447, wearing a flight attendant's uniform and carrying 30 years of buried resentment that was about to explode into the most public confrontation of their lives. To understand what happened that day at Gate B 12, we need to understand Elizabeth Geddes, a woman whose dreams had curdled into bitterness, whose protective instincts had warped into prejudice, and whose personal pain had transformed her into someone she never intended to become. Elizabeth Marie Patterson grew up in Lexington, Kentucky, in a middle-class household that represented everything the American dream promised hard-working families. Her father managed a regional bank branch. Her mother taught elementary school. Their suburban neighborhood featured manicured lawns, two-car garages, and a quiet prosperity that comes from steady employment and careful financial planning. Young Elizabeth was ambitious beyond her circumstances. While her high school classmates planned careers as teachers, nurses, or secretaries, Elizabeth dreamed of international business. She studied foreign languages, read business magazines, and fantasized about traveling the world as a corporate executive. Her senior year guidance counselor suggested flight attendant training as a practical stepping stone toward her international business ambitions. In 1982, airline deregulation had created thousands of new opportunities in aviation. Flight attendants earned good salaries, traveled extensively, and gained valuable business experience that could lead to management positions. Elizabeth embraced this advice enthusiastically. She enrolled in flight attendant training immediately after high school graduation, excelling in customer service protocols, safety procedures, and emergency response training. Her instructors praised her professionalism, attention to detail, and natural leadership abilities. At 22, Elizabeth joined Midwest Airlines as a junior flight attendant based in Louisville. The job exceeded her expectations initially. She traveled to major cities across America, earned more money than most college graduates, and gained confidence navigating complex professional situations. Romance complicated her career trajectory. She met David Geddes during a layover in Chicago, a handsome airline mechanic with steady employment and traditional values. Their courtship was brief but intense. Elizabeth was attracted to David's stability and his vision of building a conventional family life together. They married in 1985, and Elizabeth discovered that managing a career and marriage required compromises she hadn't anticipated. David wanted a wife who prioritized home life over professional advancement. Elizabeth wanted to continue pursuing her business ambitions while building their relationship. Their first child, Marcus, arrived in 1987, followed by Sarah 2 years later. Elizabeth took maternity leave both times, but returned to flying as soon as possible. The double demands of motherhood and career created stress that neither she nor David had expected. David's traditional expectations clashed with Elizabeth's professional obligations. He resented her travel schedule, her evening flights, and her weekend assignments. Elizabeth felt torn between her family responsibilities and her desire to advance within the airline industry. The marriage deteriorated gradually, then catastrophically. David's resentment about Elizabeth's career intensified after he was laid off during airline industry consolidation in the mid-1990s. He spent months unemployed, growing increasingly bitter about their role reversal. Elizabeth as primary breadwinner, David as reluctant house husband. When David finally found new employment with a different airline, he'd changed. The confident man Elizabeth had married had become insecure and controlling. He criticized her appearance, questioned her dedication to their family, and made increasingly unreasonable demands about her work schedule. The final blow came in 2001, when David announced he was leaving. No counseling, no attempt at reconciliation, just a cold declaration that he'd found someone who understood what marriage meant. Elizabeth discovered he'd been having an affair with a younger woman who worked part-time and had no career ambitions beyond supporting her husband. The divorce devastated Elizabeth financially and emotionally. David's child support payments were sporadic and insufficient. Her salary, which had seemed generous as supplemental family income, barely covered rent, childcare, and basic necessities for a single mother with 2 children. Elizabeth was forced to move from their comfortable suburban home to a smaller apartment in a transitional neighborhood where housing was affordable but demographics were dramatically different from what her children had known. Marcus and Sarah, now 12 and 10, struggled to adjust to their new environment. The local school district was underfunded and overcrowded. Elizabeth's children, who'd previously attended well-resourced suburban schools, found themselves in classrooms with outdated textbooks, overworked teachers, and students from much different backgrounds. The bullying began almost immediately. Marcus and Sarah were targeted as new kids by established social groups that sensed their discomfort and unfamiliarity with urban school culture. The harassment was relentless. Textbooks stolen, lunch money demanded, social exclusion that made every school day miserable. Elizabeth's protective instincts, already heightened by the stress of single parenthood, went into overdrive. She scheduled meetings with teachers, administrators, and school counselors, demanding protection for her children that the overburdened system couldn't provide. The incident that changed everything occurred during Marcus's second month at his new school. He came home with a split lip, torn clothing, and the defeated expression of a child whose spirit was being systematically crushed. Sarah arrived crying, explaining that she watched her older brother being beaten up by a group of students who'd cornered him after school. Elizabeth's voice, "I know it's not right, but when I see my babies hurt, something inside me just hardens. These children were suffering because I couldn't protect them from a world that seemed determined to destroy everything good we'd built together." Elizabeth's rational mind understood that bullying was about power dynamics, social hierarchies, and the casual cruelty that children inflict when adult supervision is inadequate. But her emotional response was more primitive. Someone was hurting her children, and she needed to identify threats and eliminate them. And her pain, fear, and helplessness needed a target, and racial differences provided convenient categories for organizing her anger. She began monitoring local crime reports obsessively, noting racial demographics in ways that confirmed her growing suspicions. She discovered online forums where other parents shared similar concerns, communities that reinforced her belief that her children were victims of cultural conflicts beyond their control. Elizabeth's transformation from protective mother to prejudiced professional happened gradually, almost imperceptibly. It began with heightened awareness of racial dynamics in her children's experiences, evolved into suspicious monitoring of her passengers' behavior, and eventually crystallized into discriminatory practices that she justified as maintaining professional standards. Her language changed first. She stopped referring to her children's tormentors by name and began using phrases like "those kids" and "that element." When discussing neighborhood problems with other parents, she'd lower her voice and employ coded language that everyone understood but nobody explicitly acknowledged. Online forums provided validation for her evolving worldview. She joined parent groups focused on school safety, neighborhood watch organizations, and professional flight attendant associations where subtle bias was common but never officially acknowledged. Elizabeth's work performance remained exemplary by traditional metrics. She knew safety regulations perfectly, handled emergencies professionally, and maintained the polished appearance that airlines demanded. But passenger interactions began reflecting her private prejudices in ways that were difficult to document or prove. She developed techniques for expressing discrimination that appeared policy-compliant on the surface, questioning ticket authenticity, expressing concern about passenger behavior that others hadn't noticed, enforcing regulations selectively based on her personal comfort level with different travelers. Her supervisors occasionally received passenger complaints about Elizabeth's attitude, particularly from minority travelers who felt they'd been treated differently than white passengers in similar situations. But Elizabeth's seniority, knowledge of regulations, and ability to provide policy-based justifications for her actions made disciplinary action difficult. 20 years of flight attendant experience had taught Elizabeth exactly how much discrimination she could exercise while maintaining plausible deniability. She understood which behaviors would be overlooked, which complaints would be dismissed, and which passengers were least likely to pursue formal grievances against airline staff. Elizabeth's dialogue, "I'm not racist, I'm professional." These people need to understand that first-class service requires certain standards. If they can't meet those standards, that's not discrimination. That's just basic customer service protocol. Elizabeth had convinced herself that her prejudices were justified professional judgments. She genuinely believed that she was protecting airline standards, maintaining cabin atmosphere, and ensuring that legitimate first-class passengers received the service they paid for. What Elizabeth didn't realize was that her personal pain had created blind spots that would soon collide catastrophically with forces far beyond her understanding or control. She had no idea that her next shift would bring her face-to-face with a passenger whose life's work could literally shut down every airport in America. The woman who'd once dreamed of international business success was about to discover that discrimination has consequences she'd never imagined, and that some passengers have power that can't be ignored, diminished, or dismissed. Her reckoning was waiting at Gate B, 12, carrying 30 years of marriage, a National Medal of Technology and Innovation, and the quiet dignity of a man who'd spent his entire life proving that excellence transcends prejudice, until the day he decided that sometimes you have to shut the world down to wake it up. The morning of November 15th, 2023, dawned crisp and clear in Columbus, Ohio. Dr. Edward Morrill stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse apartment, watching early morning traffic navigate the city streets 30 stories below. In 12 hours, he would be in Louisville, Kentucky, receiving the National Medal of Technology and Innovation from the President of the United States, the culmination of a 30-year career that had revolutionized airport security across America. Diane emerged from their bedroom, elegant as always in a tailored navy suit that complemented the first-class tickets she held in her manicured hands. After 3 decades of marriage, she could still take Edward's breath away. This trip represented more than professional honor. It was their celebration of building an extraordinary life together against odds that had seemed insurmountable when they were young. Edward's voice. "You know what I'm thinking about this morning?" That scared kid from Dayton who built his first security system in his parents' basement. If he could see us now, heading to Washington, D.C. on our anniversary, about to receive the country's highest technology honor, I don't think he'd believe it. Diane's response. That kid would be proud of what we've accomplished, but he'd also remind us that the work isn't finished. There are still too many barriers, too many assumptions, too many people who see our skin color before they see our achievements. Their conversation was interrupted by Edward's phone, the airport security team confirming that the new facial recognition upgrades were functioning perfectly. These weren't just any security systems. They were Edward's latest innovations, technology that could identify potential threats while protecting passenger privacy in ways that previous generations of security couldn't achieve. The drive to Columbus International Airport felt ceremonial. Edward had designed much of the security infrastructure they'd encountered today, from the perimeter monitoring systems to the advanced screening technology that allowed legitimate travelers to move through security efficiently while identifying genuine threats with unprecedented accuracy. As their rideshare vehicle approached the terminal, Edward pointed out various technological improvements that most passengers would never notice. See those cameras integrated into the lighting fixtures? My design. The sensors that detect suspicious behavior patterns without profiling based on demographics? Also mine. Even the air filtration system that can identify chemical threats. That's Morrill Security Systems technology. Diane smiled at her husband's professional pride. She understood better than anyone the obstacles Edward had overcome to reach this level of influence and recognition. The countless presentations to skeptical executives who questioned whether a black engineer could really innovate beyond existing security protocols. The contracts that went to competitors despite Edward's superior proposals. The slow, careful process of proving his expertise one successful installation at a time. But arriving at the airport brought familiar discomfort alongside professional satisfaction. Flyers. The gate agent examining their Louisville tickets hesitated just long enough to convey doubt, asking twice whether they were certain about their seat assignments, as if perhaps there had been some administrative error that had accidentally upgraded them beyond their proper station. Diane said, 30 years of this. You'd think it would stop hurting, but it doesn't. Every surprised look, every moment of hesitation, every assumption that we don't belong in first-class seating. It's death by 1,000 cuts. The exhaustion of constantly proving that we deserve the success we've earned. Edward recognized the patterns too, but his response had evolved over decades of similar experiences. Early in his career, such incidents would have triggered anger, frustration, and the exhausting process of educating people about their unconscious biases. Now, at 61, he developed a different approach. Quiet dignity that neither escalated confrontations nor accepted discriminatory treatment. "We handle this the way we always have," he murmured to Diane as they approached their gate. "Professional, courteous, and completely confident in our right to be here. We've earned these seats through 30 years of hard work, and nobody gets to make us feel otherwise." The boarding area was crowded with business travelers, families heading to Louisville for various occasions, and the usual mix of passengers that Edward's security systems had already screened, analyzed, and cleared for travel. His technology had determined that everyone in this boarding area posed no security threat. Ironic, given that the real threat to his dignity was about to emerge from an unexpected source. 2 gates away, Elizabeth Geddes was having the worst morning of her 20-year airline career. Her shift had begun with a text message from her ex-husband informing her that his child support payment would be late again, followed immediately by a call from her daughter Sarah's school reporting that she'd been sent to the principal's office for fighting. Marcus, now 24 and struggling to find stable employment, had spent the previous evening arguing with Elizabeth about money, independence, and his frustration with a job market that seemed permanently stacked against him. Elizabeth felt the familiar weight of single parenthood. Every crisis was her responsibility. Every financial shortfall her problem to solve. Her supervisor, Janet Morrison, had also chosen this morning to address Elizabeth's recent customer service evaluations. Passenger complaints about discriminatory treatment had increased over the past 6 months, and while nothing had been proven definitively, the pattern was concerning enough to warrant official attention. Supervisor's office. Elizabeth, you've been an exemplary flight attendant for 2 decades, which is why these recent complaints are so troubling. Passengers are reporting that you seem to treat minority travelers differently, questioning their tickets more extensively, enforcing policies more strictly, making them feel unwelcome in first-class seating. Elizabeth's response, Janet, I treat all passengers according to established protocols. If some people are more sensitive to standard customer service procedures, that's not discrimination. That's maintaining professional standards. But Janet's warnings echoed in Elizabeth's mind as she reviewed the passenger manifest for Flight 447 to Louisville. The first-class section included 2 passengers whose names suggested they might be African American. Dr. Edward P. Morrill and Mrs. Diane C. Morrill, seated in 1A and 1B. Elizabeth's response, great. Another upgraded situation I'll have to handle delicately. These people probably got their seats through some corporate diversity program or frequent flyer point manipulation. I'll need to verify their tickets carefully without appearing discriminatory, just professional thoroughness. Elizabeth's assumptions about the Morrills were based on years of unconscious bias that had solidified into operational prejudice. In her experience, African American passengers in first-class seating often represented what she considered irregularities, upgrades, corporate benefits, or administrative accommodations that somehow didn't reflect genuine first-class status. She developed techniques for addressing these situations that appeared policy-compliant while expressing her skepticism about passenger legitimacy, requesting additional identification, questioning ticket authenticity, suggesting that passengers might be more comfortable in main cabin seating where they wouldn't feel out of place. As passengers began boarding Flight 447, Elizabeth positioned herself at the aircraft entrance with her practiced professional smile and the internal tension that always accompanied flights with diverse first-class passengers. She'd learned to manage her prejudices carefully, expressing discrimination in ways that were difficult to prove or prosecute. The early boarding passengers were familiar types, business travelers in expensive suits, elderly couples celebrating anniversaries or special occasions, frequent flyers whose platinum status was immediately recognizable. Elizabeth greeted them warmly, efficiently checking tickets while making the small talk that established proper first-class atmosphere. Then Dr. and Mrs. Morrill approached. Edward and Diane Morrill walked down the jet bridge with the quiet confidence that comes from 3 decades of professional success and personal achievement. Edward carried a leather briefcase containing the speech he'd deliver after receiving the National Medal of Technology and Innovation. Diane had her Nursing Association materials. She'd been invited to address the conference about healthcare equity in major medical institutions. Elizabeth's reaction was immediate and carefully controlled. Her professional smile remained in place, but her body language shifted subtly. She positioned herself more directly in the boarding path, creating a natural checkpoint that would require the Morrills to stop and interact with her more extensively than other passengers had experienced. Elizabeth's greeting, "Good afternoon. May I see your boarding passes and identification, please?" The request was delivered with practiced politeness, but Edward immediately recognized the undertone. Other first-class passengers had been greeted warmly and waved through with minimal ticket examination. He and Diane were receiving more scrutiny, more verification, more professional attention than their fellow travelers. Edward handed over their documents with calm professionalism. Their first-class tickets were legitimate, their identification current, their confirmations properly documented. But Elizabeth examined everything with unusual thoroughness, checking details that she'd ignored for previous passengers. Elizabeth's response: "These are lovely seats, 1A and 1B. Very exclusive placement. May I ask how you obtained these particular assignments?" The question was inappropriate and discriminatory, but phrased in a way that could be dismissed as customer service curiosity. Edward recognized the technique from decades of similar encounters, but he also understood that direct confrontation would only escalate an already uncomfortable situation. Ability. Elizabeth's follow-up: "How wonderful for you both. Now, I noticed these seats were originally reserved for airline personnel, and there might be some confusion about availability. Would you be more comfortable in our main cabin, where you have more space and less formality?" The suggestion was discriminatory and completely fabricated, but delivered with the polished professionalism that Elizabeth had perfected over 20 years of similar encounters. She was offering the Morrills an opportunity to voluntarily accept downgraded seating, while avoiding a more public confrontation about their legitimacy. Diane felt her husband tense beside her. She recognized the warning signs: Edward's jaw tightening, his breathing becoming more controlled, the quiet intensity that preceded moments when his patience finally reached its limit. Diane's whispered counsel: "Baby, let's just take different seats. It's not worth the confrontation. We've dealt with this before." But Edward's response surprised even his wife of 30 years. Edward's firm reply: "Ma'am, we're celebrating our 30th anniversary. These seats were specifically chosen and properly purchased. We'll be keeping our assigned seating, thank you." Other first-class passengers were beginning to notice the extended interaction. Business travelers who'd been seated quickly were watching from their assigned places, curious about the delay. The young African-American businessman in seat 3A was paying particular attention, recognizing dynamics that were familiar from his own travel experiences. Elizabeth realized that her usual techniques weren't working with these passengers. They weren't intimidated by her authority. They weren't accepting her suggestions for alternative seating. And they were beginning to attract attention that could complicate her situation if they decided to file formal complaints. She escalated to her next level of discrimination, questioning the legitimacy of their tickets directly. Elizabeth's accusation: "I'm going to need to verify these reservations with our booking system. There have been some irregularities with fraudulent first-class tickets recently, and I want to ensure that legitimate passengers aren't inconvenienced by any administrative errors." The accusation was serious, public, and potentially defamatory. Elizabeth was essentially suggesting that the Morrills had obtained their seats through fraudulent means, creating a situation that would justify removing them from the aircraft if they couldn't prove their innocence. Edward's extensive military and security experience had taught him to recognize escalating confrontations and respond appropriately. He understood that Elizabeth was creating a situation designed to humiliate them into voluntary compliance or provide justification for their removal. Edward responded in a calm tone: "I've faced down enemy combatants in desert warfare. I've negotiated multi-million-dollar security contracts with skeptical executives. I've spent 30 years proving that excellence transcends prejudice. I can handle one scared flight attendant who doesn't understand what she's actually confronting." But this moment felt different from previous encounters with discrimination. Perhaps it was the significance of their anniversary celebration, or the importance of the national honor he was about to receive, or simply the accumulated weight of 30 years of having to prove his legitimacy over and over again. Whatever the reason, Edward made a decision that would change everything. Edward's measured response: "Ma'am, I understand you have procedures to follow. Here are our confirmation numbers, our credit card receipt, and our frequent flyer documentation. Everything is in order, and we're not moving from our assigned seats." Elizabeth found herself in unfamiliar territory. Most passengers who faced her discriminatory challenges either accepted alternative arrangements or became sufficiently flustered to justify her concerns about their suitability for first-class service. The Morrills were responding with calm professionalism that made her appear unreasonable by comparison. What Elizabeth didn't realize was that she just challenged a man whose security clearance was higher than most government officials, whose technology protected every airport in America, and whose patience for systematic discrimination had finally reached its absolute limit. Dr. Edward Morrill had built systems that protected millions of travelers every day. But now he was about to discover whether those same systems could protect his own dignity when prejudice tried to destroy everything he'd worked 30 years to achieve. The confrontation at Gate B-12 was about to escalate beyond anything Elizabeth Geddes had ever experienced, and beyond anything she could possibly control. What happened next would be recorded by a dozen smartphones, shared across social media platforms, and eventually become required viewing in diversity training programs across the airline industry. But in that moment, Elizabeth Geddes made a decision that revealed the true depth of her prejudice and set in motion consequences she couldn't possibly have imagined. Elizabeth reached for the aircraft's intercom system. Elizabeth's announcement, "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some seating irregularities that need to be resolved before departure. We apologize for any inconvenience and appreciate your patience while we verify passenger documentation." The announcement was deliberately vague, but clearly directed at the Morrills, who remained standing in the aisle, while other passengers watched with growing discomfort. Elizabeth had created a public spectacle designed to pressure them into voluntary compliance through social embarrassment. Elizabeth's continued pressure, "Dr. and Mrs. Morrill, I'm going to need you to step off the aircraft temporarily while we contact our reservations department to verify your booking details. This is standard procedure when there are questions about ticket authenticity." The lie was brazen and completely fabricated. Elizabeth had no authority to remove passengers based on unsubstantiated suspicions, and she certainly had no evidence of ticket fraud. But she was counting on the Morrill's unwillingness to create a public scene that would disrupt other passengers' travel plans. The young African-American businessman in seat 3A could no longer remain silent. Kevin Thompson was a successful financial advisor who'd experienced similar discrimination countless times during his own business travels. He unbuckled his seatbelt and approached the confrontation. Kevin's intervention, "Excuse me, ma'am, but I couldn't help noticing the unusual attention you're giving these passengers. I'd be happy to switch seats with them if there's some kind of seating conflict that needs to be resolved." Elizabeth's response revealed the racial motivation behind her actions. Proved that her concerns about seating irregularities were completely fabricated. Kevin's challenge, "Ma'am, I travel first class regularly, and I've never seen passengers asked to deplane for ticket verification. What specific policy requires this procedure?" Elizabeth found herself cornered by Kevin's direct questioning. She couldn't cite legitimate policies that didn't exist, but she also couldn't admit that her actions were based on personal prejudice rather than professional requirements. Meanwhile, Diane was experiencing the familiar exhaustion that comes from being publicly scrutinized, questioned, and humiliated because of her skin color. After 3 decades as a successful hospital administrator, she still had to endure situations where strangers assumed she didn't belong in professional environments. Diane's quiet counsel, "Edward, baby, let's just move to different seats. It's not worth disrupting everyone's travel plans. We've dealt with this kind of situation before." But Edward's response surprised everyone, including his wife. Edward's firm declaration, "No, Diane, not this time. Not today. Not on our 30th anniversary. And not when I'm about to receive the highest technology honor this country can bestow. We're keeping our seats, and this flight attendant is going to learn what happens when discrimination meets its match." Elizabeth realized that her usual techniques were failing spectacularly. The Morrills weren't intimidated. Other passengers were questioning her authority, and she was creating exactly the kind of public incident that airline management wanted to avoid. But instead of de-escalating, Elizabeth doubled down on her discriminatory approach. Elizabeth's escalation, "I'm calling airport security to resolve the situation. These passengers are being disruptive and refusing to comply with legitimate airline policies." The accusation was serious and potentially career-ending for the Morrills if it appeared on their travel records. Elizabeth was essentially criminalizing their refusal to accept discriminatory treatment, creating documentation that could affect their future travel opportunities. Edward felt something shift inside him. The same cold focus that had helped him survive combat situations in the Gulf War, designed security systems under impossible deadlines, and navigate 3 decades of professional excellence despite systematic discrimination. Edward's internal resolution. I've spent my entire career protecting people who wouldn't hesitate to question my right to exist in their spaces. I've designed systems that keep people like this flight attendant safe while they discriminate against people who look like me. Maybe it's time for a demonstration of exactly who they're dealing with. Airport security arrived within minutes. 2 officers who recognized immediately that they were walking into a racially charged situation with no clear resolution. The senior officer, Marcus Williams, was an African-American veteran who'd worked airport security for 15 years and had witnessed similar confrontations countless times. Security Officer Williams, what seems to be the problem here? Elizabeth launched into her prepared explanation about ticket irregularities, documentation concerns, and passenger noncompliance with airline policies. But her story contained inconsistencies that Williams recognized immediately. Security Officer Williams, ma'am, I've been working airport security for 15 years, and I've never seen passengers removed for the reasons you're describing. Do you have specific evidence of ticket fraud or legitimate safety concerns? Elizabeth's refusal. Sir, that won't be necessary. The issue isn't seating availability. It's documentation verification that requires passenger cooperation with our security protocols. Kevin realized immediately that Elizabeth was creating pretexts to justify discriminatory treatment. Her willingness to refuse his seat switching offered proof that her concerns about seating irregularities were completely fabricated. Kevin's challenge, ma'am, I travel first class regularly and I've never seen passengers asked to deplane for ticket verification. What specific policy requires this procedure? Elizabeth found herself cornered by Kevin's direct questioning. She couldn't cite legitimate policies that didn't exist, but she also couldn't admit that her actions were based on personal prejudice rather than professional requirements. Meanwhile, Diane was experiencing the familiar exhaustion that comes from being publicly scrutinized, questioned, and humiliated because of her skin color. After 3 decades as a successful hospital administrator, she still had to endure situations where strangers assumed she didn't belong in professional environments. Diane's quiet counsel, Edward, baby, let's just move to different seats. It's not worth disrupting everyone's travel plans. We've dealt with this kind of situation before. But Edward's response surprised everyone, including his wife. Edward's firm declaration, no, Diane, not this time, not today, not on our 30th anniversary, and not when I'm about to receive the highest technology honor this country can bestow. We're keeping our seats, and this flight attendant is going to learn what happens when discrimination meets its match. Elizabeth realized that her usual techniques were failing spectacularly. The Morrills weren't intimidated. Other passengers were questioning her authority, and she was creating exactly the kind of public incident that airline management wanted to avoid. But instead of de-escalating, Elizabeth doubled down on her discriminatory approach. Elizabeth's escalation. I'm calling airport security to resolve the situation. These passengers are being disruptive and refusing to comply with legitimate airline policies. The accusation was serious and potentially career-ending for the Morrills if it appeared on their travel records. Elizabeth was essentially criminalizing their refusal to accept discriminatory treatment, creating documentation that could affect their future travel opportunities. Edward felt something shift inside him. The same cold focus that helped him survive combat situations in the Gulf War, design security systems under impossible deadlines, and navigate 3 decades of professional excellence despite systematic discrimination. Edward's internal resolution. I've spent my entire career protecting people who wouldn't hesitate to question my right to exist in their spaces. I've designed systems that keep people like this flight attendant safe while they discriminate against people who look like me. Maybe it's time for a demonstration of exactly who they're dealing with. Airport security arrived within minutes. 2 officers who recognized immediately that they were walking into a racially charged situation with no clear resolution. The senior officer, Marcus Williams, was an African-American veteran who'd worked airport security for 15 years and had witnessed similar confrontations countless times. It contained inconsistencies that Williams recognized immediately. Security Officer Williams, ma'am, I've been working airport security for 15 years, and I've never seen passengers removed for the reasons you're describing. Do you have specific evidence of ticket fraud or legitimate safety concerns? Elizabeth realized that airport security wasn't automatically supporting her position. These officers understood airline policies better than she'd expected, and they were asking questions that exposed the weaknesses in her discriminatory approach. Meanwhile, Captain James Rodriguez had been monitoring the situation from the cockpit. As a Latino pilot who'd faced his own share of discrimination during his aviation career, he understood the dynamics at play and knew that Elizabeth was creating legal liability for the airline. Captain Rodriguez emerged from the cockpit to assess the situation personally. Captain Rodriguez said, "What's the delay? We need to maintain our departure schedule." Elizabeth briefed the captain with the same fabricated concerns about ticket authenticity and passenger cooperation, but Rodriguez immediately recognized the discriminatory nature of her actions. Captain Rodriguez's response, "Ma'am, these passengers have valid tickets, proper identification, and legitimate seat assignments. Unless you have specific evidence of fraud or safety violations, we're proceeding with normal boarding procedures." But Elizabeth had gone too far to retreat gracefully. Her prejudice, combined with the public nature of the confrontation, pushed her toward a final escalation that would prove to be the biggest mistake of her professional life. Elizabeth's ultimate threat: "Captain, these passengers are making threats and creating a hostile environment. I don't feel safe serving them during the flight, and I think they should be removed for the comfort and safety of our legitimate first-class passengers." The accusation was defamatory, completely unfounded, and legally actionable. Elizabeth had escalated from discriminatory service to false accusations that could result in criminal charges against the Morrills. Edward had reached his breaking point. Edward Morrill had spent 61 years learning to navigate discrimination with dignity, professionalism, and a kind of excellence that made prejudice difficult to justify. But Elizabeth Geddes had just crossed a line that transformed a service dispute into something much more serious. Edward calmly reached into his briefcase and withdrew his identification. Edward's quiet power. "Captain Rodriguez, I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about who you're dealing with here." Edward handed the captain his Transportation Security Administration contractor identification, his Department of Defense security clearance documentation, and his invitation to receive the National Medal of Technology and Innovation. Captain Rodriguez's expression changed immediately as he recognized the name and credentials. "Captain Rodriguez, Dr. Edward Morrill, the Dr. Morrill who designed our airport security systems." Edward's calm confirmation: "The same Dr. Morrill whose technology screened every passenger on this aircraft, including your flight attendant. The same systems that are currently monitoring this entire conversation and recording every discriminatory action that's occurred in the past 20 minutes. Elizabeth still didn't understand the significance of what was happening. She'd spent so much energy justifying her prejudices that she hadn't processed the information being presented about Edward's actual identity and capabilities. Edward's continued revelation: "Captain, I've spent 30 years ensuring that people like Ms. Geddes can do their jobs safely and efficiently. My facial recognition systems identified every passenger boarding this aircraft. My threat detection algorithms cleared everyone in first-class seating. My behavioral analysis protocols determined that the only security risk on this flight is a flight attendant who's been discriminating against legitimate passengers." Airport Security Officer Williams realized he was witnessing something unprecedented: a passenger who possessed security clearances and system access that exceeded most government officials. "Officer Williams, Dr. Morrill, sir, we apologize for any inconvenience. Is there anything we can do to resolve the situation?" Edward pulled out his smartphone and opened a custom application that most people would never see direct access to the airport's integrated security systems that he designed and continued to maintain. Edward's demonstration: "Actually, there is something you can do. You can watch what happens when discrimination meets technology." The smartphone screen displayed the airport central security interface, camera feeds, sensor networks, access control systems, and threat detection protocols that Edward had created and could control remotely. Edward's quiet warning: "Ms. Geddes, you spent the past 30 minutes discriminating against passengers whose safety depends on the systems I built. You've made false accusations, created a legal pretext for removal, and demonstrated exactly the kind of bias that makes air travel dangerous for people who look like me." Elizabeth was beginning to realize that she'd made a catastrophic error in judgment, but she still didn't understand the full scope of Edward's capabilities or the consequences that were about to unfold. Edward's final offer. I'm going to give you one opportunity to apologize, restore our seats, and begin treating all passengers with the dignity and respect that your profession demands. Because if you refuse, I'm going to demonstrate exactly who you've been discriminating against, and exactly what I'm capable of when prejudice threatens my family. Elizabeth's response would determine whether this confrontation ended with apologies and education, or escalated into a demonstration of power that would shut down the entire airport and change her life forever. Elizabeth's defiant refusal. I don't care who you claim to be. You're being disruptive, and I want you removed from this aircraft immediately. Edward looked at his wife, then at Captain Rodriguez, then at the gathered passengers who were recording every moment on their smartphones. Edward's final decision. Very well, Miss Geddes. You've made your choice. Now let me show you exactly what happens when you discriminate against a man who built the systems that keep American aviation safe. Edward's finger moved toward his smartphone screen, preparing to initiate a security demonstration that would ground every flight in the airport and prove, once and for all, that prejudice has consequences that extend far beyond the people it targets. The man they'd tried to humiliate was about to show them exactly who they were dealing with, and exactly what he was capable of when 30 years of patience finally reached its limit. What happened next will be studied in business schools, discussed in ethics classes, and remembered as the day that systematic discrimination met its technological match. Dr. Edward Morrill's finger touched his smartphone screen. Immediately, every departure board in Columbus International Airport went dark. Gate displays flickered and died. The background music that provided ambient atmosphere in terminal waiting areas fell silent. Security monitors throughout the facility displayed a single message in bold letters. System offline. E. Morrill override. Edward's calm explanation. Ladies and gentlemen, don't be alarmed. Everyone is perfectly safe. I've simply disabled non-essential systems to demonstrate a point about respect, dignity, and the consequences of discrimination. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Airport security personnel throughout the terminal began receiving alerts on their communication devices. Gate agents found their computers unresponsive. Even the automated announcements that typically echoed to concourses fell silent. Elizabeth Geddes finally understood the magnitude of her mistake. Elizabeth's shocked realization. You can't just shut down an airport. That's impossible. That's illegal. Edward's measured response. Ms. Geddes, I didn't shut down the airport. I shut down the systems that I built, that I maintain, and that I control through legitimate contractual authority with the Transportation Security Administration. Essential safety systems are still functioning perfectly: life support, emergency communications, fire suppression. But the convenience systems that make modern air travel possible, those are mine to control. Captain Rodriguez was simultaneously impressed and concerned. He'd heard of Dr. Morrill's legendary security innovations, but he'd never imagined witnessing such a demonstration of technological power. Captain Rodriguez. Dr. Morrill, sir, how long do you intend to maintain the system shut down? Edward's conditional response. That depends entirely on Ms. Geddes and her willingness to learn from this experience. The systems will be restored when she demonstrates the respect and professionalism that every passenger deserves, regardless of their race, appearance, or assumptions about their economic status. Airport Security Chief David Thompson arrived at the gate within minutes, accompanied by senior airline management and several TSA officials who recognized the severity of the situation. Thompson had worked with Dr. Morrill on multiple security upgrades and understood both his technical capabilities and his unimpeachable professional reputation. Security Chief Thompson. Dr. Morrill, sir, we need the systems restored immediately. We have thousands of passengers affected by the shutdown. Edward's educational moment. Chief Thompson, you're absolutely correct that thousands of passengers are affected, but those passengers are experiencing a minor inconvenience because one flight attendant chose to discriminate against legitimate travelers. Perhaps this is an opportunity for everyone to understand how individual prejudice can have systemic consequences. The gathered crowd had grown to include passengers from other flights, airport employees, and even some media representatives who've been alerted by social media posts about the unusual situation. Edward found himself addressing a much larger audience than he'd initially intended. Edward's broader message: ladies and gentlemen, I want you to understand what you've witnessed here today. My wife and I are successful professionals celebrating our 30th wedding anniversary. We purchased legitimate first-class tickets for a trip to Louisville, where I'll receive the National Medal of Technology and Innovation tomorrow. But despite our credentials, our achievements, and our completely appropriate behavior, we were subjected to discrimination that escalated to false accusations and threats of removal. The crowd listened intently as Edward continued his impromptu education session. Edward's systemic analysis. This kind of discrimination happens to African American travelers thousands of times every day across America. Most of those travelers don't have the technological resources to demonstrate their worth in such a dramatic fashion. They simply endure the humiliation, accept the unequal treatment, and continue traveling while being reminded that their achievements don't protect them from prejudice. Elizabeth stood silent, finally comprehending the full scope of her actions and their consequences. She wasn't just dealing with angry passengers. She was confronting a man whose work was essential to American aviation security and whose demonstration of power was creating national attention. Elizabeth Getty's experienced what psychologists call a moment of moral clarity, the sudden recognition that her behavior had been fundamentally wrong and that her prejudices had transformed her into someone she'd never intended to become. The security system shutdown continued, creating an eerie quiet throughout the terminal that emphasized the extraordinary nature of what was occurring. Elizabeth realized that her career was effectively over, but more importantly, she began to understand how her personal pain had corrupted her professional judgment. Elizabeth's breakdown: Dr. Morrill, I'm so sorry. I don't know how to explain what I've done here today. My children were hurt at school, and I let that pain turn me into someone I don't recognize. I let fear and resentment poison my judgment until I started seeing threats where none existed. Elizabeth's apology was genuine, but Edward wasn't finished with his educational demonstration. Edward's response: Ms. Geddes, your apology is a beginning, but it doesn't address the systematic nature of the discrimination you practiced. How many other passengers have experienced similar treatment? How many families have had their travel experiences ruined by your assumptions and prejudices? Elizabeth couldn't answer because the truth was too painful to acknowledge. Over the past several years, her discriminatory practices had affected dozens of minority passengers who've been questioned, challenged, and humiliated in ways that white passengers never experienced. Diane, despite everything that had occurred, felt her nursing instincts engage as she recognized Elizabeth's genuine distress and emotional breakdown. Diane's compassionate intervention: Elizabeth, may I call you Elizabeth? I can see that you're suffering, and I understand that pain can make us do things we never thought we were capable of. But you have an opportunity here to learn from this experience and become someone better than the person who discriminated against us today. Elizabeth looked up through her tears at the woman she tried to humiliate, seeing perhaps for the first time the humanity and dignity of people she'd been trained by her own pain to dismiss as unworthy. Elizabeth's recognition: Mrs. Morrill, you're showing me more kindness than I deserve after what I've put you through. I let my children's experiences turn me against people who had nothing to do with their pain. I became exactly the kind of person who makes the world worse instead of better. Edward accessed his smartphone again, bringing up security footage that showed Elizabeth's own children at their school interacting positively with classmates of all backgrounds, including African American students who were helping them with homework and including them in social activities. Edward's teaching moment: Elizabeth, your children are better people than you've been giving them credit for. They've learned to find common ground with kids from different backgrounds, but you've been teaching them to see differences as threats. Don't let your pain rob them of the ability to build relationships across racial lines. The demonstration was having its intended effect not just on Elizabeth, but on everyone witnessing the confrontation. Passengers were recording and sharing the incident, creating a viral moment that would spark national conversations about discrimination, power, and the importance of treating all people with dignity regardless of their appearance. Edward had made his point as dramatically as possible, but he also understood that prolonged system shutdowns affected innocent travelers who had nothing to do with Elizabeth's discriminatory behavior. Edward Systematic Restoration. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to restore the airport systems now. But I want everyone to remember what you witnessed here today. Discrimination isn't just morally wrong. It's also practically stupid. When you judge people based on their appearance rather than their character and capabilities, you might find yourself discriminating against someone who has the power to shut down your entire world. Edward's smartphone screen showed the security system interface as he methodically reactivated each component. Departure boards flickered back to life. Gate displays resumed showing flight information. The ambient sounds of functioning airport gradually returned. The crowd that had gathered to witness the confrontation began applauding, not just for the restoration of airport services, but for the educational demonstration they'd experienced about dignity, respect, and the consequences of prejudice. Captain Rodriguez approached Edward with genuine respect and gratitude. Captain Rodriguez, Dr. Morrill, on behalf of the airline, I apologize for the treatment you and your wife experienced today. We'll be conducting a comprehensive review of our customer service protocols to ensure this kind of discrimination doesn't happen again. Elizabeth was escorted away by airline management for immediate disciplinary action, but not before approaching Edward and Diane one final time. Elizabeth's final apology, Dr. and Mrs. Morrill. I know my apology can't undo the humiliation I caused you, but I want you to know that this experience has changed me. I'm going to get help from my prejudices and work to become the kind of person my children can be proud of. Edward's gracious response. Elizabeth, we accept your apology, and we hope you'll use this experience to become an advocate for equal treatment rather than an obstacle to it. Everyone deserves the opportunity to learn and grow from their mistakes. As Flight 447 finally prepared for departure, Edward and Diane took their rightfully assigned first-class seats to a standing ovation from their fellow passengers. The young businessman Kevin Thompson raised his glass of champagne in a toast. Kevin's tribute to Dr. and Mrs. Morrill for showing us all that excellence, dignity, and technological power are the best responses to discrimination. The flight to Louisville proceeded without incident, and the next day, Dr. Edward P. Morrill received the National Medal of Technology and Innovation from the President of the United States in a ceremony that was attended by hundreds of technology leaders, government officials, and family members who traveled from across the country to honor his achievements. During his acceptance speech, Edward referenced the previous day's incident without naming specific individuals or airlines. Edward's medal acceptance speech excerpt. This honor represents not just my individual achievements, but the potential that exists in every American when they're given equal opportunities to succeed. Yesterday, I was reminded that we still have work to do in ensuring that all citizens are judged by their character and capabilities rather than their appearance. But I was also reminded that excellence, patience, and the willingness to stand up for dignity can overcome even the most entrenched prejudices. That evening, Edward and Diane celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary with a quiet dinner at a Louisville restaurant, followed by dancing to the same song they'd enjoyed at their wedding 3 decades earlier. Diane's reflection. So, what did you learn today, Mr. Medal winner? Edward's conclusion. I learned that sometimes you have to shut the world down to wake it up, but more importantly, I learned that the systems I've built to protect strangers are meaningless if we can't protect each other's dignity in everyday interactions. Dr. Edward P. Morrill security systems continue to protect over 450 airports nationwide, screening millions of passengers annually while maintaining the privacy and dignity that he believes every traveler deserves. Elizabeth Getty's completed comprehensive sensitivity training and now works as an advocate for workplace equality, sharing her story as a cautionary example of how personal pain can corrupt professional judgment. The incident at Columbus International Airport became a viral sensation, generating millions of views and sparking national conversations about unconscious bias, systemic discrimination, and the importance of treating every person with the dignity and respect that their humanity demands. Sometimes the best way to fight discrimination is to show people exactly what they stand to lose when they choose hate over humanity. And sometimes the most powerful response to prejudice is the quiet demonstration that excellence transcends every barrier that ignorance tries to construct. In a world where technology connects us all, discrimination isn't just morally wrong. It's a luxury that none of us can afford. Because you never know when the person you're discriminating against might be the one who built the systems that keep your world running smoothly. Dr. Edward and Mrs. Diane Morrill prove that dignity, love, and 30 years of shared excellence are the most powerful forces for change, and that sometimes the best education happens when a teacher has the power to turn off the lights until everyone learns a lesson. This story reminds us that behind every successful person is a lifetime of overcoming barriers that others never faced. Dr. Edward Morrill's security innovations protect millions of travelers daily, but his greatest achievement was never letting discrimination diminish his belief in human dignity. What would you have done in this situation? Share your thought in the comments below. And remember, excellence is the best revenge, but sometimes you need to demonstrate your power to make people understand what they're really dealing with. Subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who did extraordinary things when faced with discrimination, prejudice, and systematic inequality. Because everyone has the power to change the world. Sometimes you just need to shut it down first to get people's attention.